I'd like to start off by just looking at the way things work within our ecosystem and some of the linkages that are in our ecosystem. And obviously, we've got to be making a profit if we're in agriculture. So profit's a function of gross margin, it's also a function of overheads and turnover. But if we just follow the gross margin route, whether you're in cropping or in grazing, it's also a function of plant productivity. And plant productivity is a function of plant available water and nutrients. Plant available water and nutrients is a function of cation exchange capacity. And cation exchange capacity is a function of soil organic carbon and particularly humus. Humus is a function of biological activity. And biological activity is a function of food, shelter, water and air. And food, shelter, water and air is a function of plant productivity. And when you look at that, you'll find that what we've actually created and what is there is a cycle, and every bit of that works as part of that cycle. But it's not only a cycle. What I believe, it's a spiral. And we have a choice in agriculture. We can either spiral our ecosystems up or we spiral them down. And we're basically only going in one of two directions. We're not going to be static in a biological system. We make a choice as to whether we're going to spiral those systems up or whether we're going to spiral them down. And the starting point, or one of the places where we can start to make this change, is with soil health. And I totally agree with Alan again that management is the key. It's the choices that we make around everything that we do that decides and determines the outcomes. I had a guy on the radio the other day tried to push me about drought management, you know, how people can't manage drought because they've got too much debt, etc., etc. But it's a choice that people make as to how you manage and how you react to a drought or anything other circumstance that you get. But the thing we've got to learn to manage is biology. We are in a biological system and we're either spiralling up or spiralling down in that biological system. And what we need to start learning to manage is biology instead of physics and chemistry, because it's the biology that will determine the chemistry and the physics. But we might need a little bit of chemistry. So if we need a bit, well then that's fine. We can put some of that chemistry on, but it should not be the focus. It should be a little addition if it's going to help the biology. And of course we need biodiversity, and we've got to manage for biodiversity. Every ecosystem that exists naturally has biodiversity in it, and we've got to get back there. And we have a broad number of tools that we can use in order to start making these changes. We've got grazing systems, and it looks like from the show of hands earlier that pretty well everyone in this room is a convert to doing things differently with grazing management. But we've got cover crops, green manuring crops, crop rotations, aeration of soil is very critical, and rehydration of landscape is also one of those tools that more and more people, fortunately these days, are starting to use. We can add biology to our soils using compost extracts, provided we use the right compost. We've still got access to fertilisers and the catalysts that we can use within our system, and we've got to add and manage for biodiversity. But rule number one when it comes to agriculture is do no harm, and that is do no harm to soil biology. Because if we hurt soil biology, we hurt absolutely everything else. And when we look at farming systems, for example, there's a whole lot of things that we use traditionally in our agricultural systems that harm biology. And there are many alternatives to those things that harm biology. And so what we need to look at doing is changing. And when we change and stop harming biology and work with biology, we can start that spiral up. And it's one of the catalytic places in which we can start to work from. And I love this little statement. It was written quite a long time ago. In nature, there are no rewards or punishments only consequences. And one of the consequences of agriculture in the last 10,000 years, and I don't just pick out the current generation of farmers, is that I believe, and as farmers we're quite critical of miners, but farmers have been the greatest miners in the world. We have mined more landscape and more country and more carbon and more minerals and more soil than the miners will ever get to touch. And it's time we recognise that. And so by mining our ecosystems, we've shrunk this eco-pie. And I look at this as a pie, and we've got carbon in there, we've got ecosystem services, and we've got our water cycle, energy flow, biodiversity, and soil health as part of that pie. But all of those things are interrelated. We cannot separate out those parts of that pie. So it makes sense to me that through lack of knowledge, we've shrunk the size of that pie over the last 10,000 years, that if we change our management, we can increase the size of that pie. And to take a leaf out of Charlie Massey's book, it's the mechanical mind that's led us to mining our land. What we need to do is start thinking about how do we increase the size of that ecological pie, and to use Charlie's words, that's going to take the emergent mind. It's going to take a mind shift from people, and again, Alan touched on that this morning, just a perfect message. It's us, it's our choices, it's management, where all of this stuff starts and finishes. And when I first did these courses, about 89 in fact, I started on this journey, and I learned about energy flow. And energy flow at that stage was simply about utilising sunlight energy more effectively. And it still is. But what we know today with today's science is that our current industrial agricultural systems are using the capacity of photosynthesis to about 10 to 15% of the capacity of the system. And we know that in both commercial systems and in research systems, where water is not the constraint, we can at least take that to 55, 56% of photosynthetic capacity. And those of us that are operating in dryland systems, I think our challenge is to double our photosynthetic capacity, because we do have limiting water at some stage. And as we increase photosynthetic capacity, or the ability of our system, that capacity to use sunlight energy, we increase productivity. And increasing productivity through better use of sunlight energy and the free resources that we get is going to increase our profitability. So how do we go about that? The foundation, I believe, is biological biodiversity within our soil. We've got to get that the diversity into our soil, but the diversity by itself is not going to do the job. We have to manage the population. We've got to increase the population of that biodiversity in our soil. And as we increase that population of a biodiverse community within our soils, we'll reach quorum sensing. And when we reach quorum sensing, the system starts to work. Mother Nature is going to drive the system forward for us. And what will happen then is we're going to get increased soil organic carbon, we're going to get more humus production, and we're going to increase cation exchange capacity because we're increasing humus. As we increase all of those things, and as our biology starts to heal itself and work correctly within the soil, the biology starts to feed the plants the way plants were designed to be fed. And when plants get fed in the right way, productivity goes up. We get increased photosynthesis, we get increased Brix level in our plant community, and we get increased productivity. And the potential, if you've got irrigation, is 5 times greater than what you think you can do right now. And I know examples of in the dairy industry where farmers have gone from 8 to 9 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year under irrigation on ryegrass systems using 500 units of nitrogen to producing 50 tonnes of dry matter a year with no nitrogen and 20% less water. And that's the potential that's in front of us. And I had the privilege, I'm not sure it was actually a privilege, a couple of years ago to speak in Parliament House to the party room of the National Party. And this is my opening slide, that agriculture flounders and mines its resources because our population is not prepared to pay the full price of producing food. And for 10,000 years, the rest of that price has been paid by our environment. And we've got to change that. And one of the ways in which we can change that is to bring income back into the farming communities from carbon and environmental credits. So what I want to talk about a little bit now is carbon and soil carbon, because it's the centre, it's the bullseye that we're heading for within this ecological pie. We're dealing with a 375 million year old bit of technology, photosynthesis. And the carbon cycle itself started way back then when the carbon level in the atmosphere was 7,000 parts per million. It was photosynthesis that took it from 7,000 parts per million back to 300 parts per million. And so we've got photosynthesis during the process of birth, growth and reproduction. And then we've got oxidation during the other side of that equation, where the carbon joins up with oxygen again. Sequestration is the difference between photosynthesis and oxidation. And we don't want to stop a carbon cycle, we actually want to accelerate it. Without that cycle, we can't sequester carbon. So it's not about sequestration, it's about increasing cycling. And as we increase cycling, keeping more behind within the system. And we know a lot, and particularly science knows a fair bit about decomposition. What science doesn't seem to know a lot about is the liquid carbon pathway, what Christine Jones calls the liquid carbon pathway, and that is root exudates. And we now know that carbon from root exudates is about 5 times more important in terms of sequestration than root material left within the soil. And that's all created for biology. So if we look at, I thought I'd look at some sequestration rates. If you look at the literature, generally in regen ag, in grazing industries, around about 1 tonne of carbon per hectare per annum is an average. And if we look at cropping systems, about 1.5 tonnes per hectare per annum is a reasonable expectation. So if we look at, I just compared 1 tonne, 1.5 tonne and 2 tonnes of carbon, not CO2, of actual carbon, soil organic carbon per hectare per year. And you'll notice that as the sequestration rate goes up, there's a significant difference in the income. The biggest driver of profitability in terms of a carbon project for farmers is the sequestration rate. The biggest driver of your profitability in terms of productivity is carbon and all the things that hang off carbon within your soil. Carbon's a proxy for everything else that we need to get right in our systems. And you'll see the internal rates of return on doing carbon projects there and this was a 2,000 hectare project, and all of those numbers have actually been run through the 40 pages of equations in the current soil carbon methodology. So you're looking at internal rates of return there on the bottom that are pretty impressive. The second thing that drives profitability from a carbon project is the price of carbon, and the third is measuring it, and then the scale of project. So the bigger the scale of project, the more we actually, the easier it is to make a good profit out of it. But one of the difficulties is how do we go about measuring this stuff accurately? And we've done some experiments recently where in 2016, when we measured this particular property it's the same bit of country, using a different stratification technique, we measured it plus or minus 12.5 tonnes of carbon per hectare as a variance. Now that's not acceptable. We've now got some real science driven into this and we were able to measure this just recently, the same area, plus or minus 1 tonne of carbon. So we're 10 times more accurate than we were even 6 months ago, and that accuracy is getting better and better, and I think we'll be double that by the end of this year. So it's typical sort of soil sampling. We get out and take some samples. We analyse them through this equipment here, and I haven't got time to go into the technology, but it's a non-destructive way of measuring soil carbon. It also measures it all the way down the soil core, measures bulk density all the way down the soil core. A lot of people are interested in what happens during a drought. Now, this is a property that we measured in 2016. We measured it 3 years later, and 2 out of those 3 years were in drought, so bad that he was destocked for 18 months of that time. And if you have a look at the percent carbon there, you'll see that he's actually sequestered carbon with 2 years out of 3 in a drought and held onto it. So that was pretty good news. And the thing that makes this work from your perspective is that 1 tonne of soil carbon equals 3.67 tonnes of CO2. And that is the equation that actually makes it work for agriculture. That's the only equation I'm aware of in agriculture that works in your favour. So just finish off with a couple of photographs of what it looks like. You can see there a continuously grazed, cell grazed system on the right, and when you look at the soil, you'll see a difference. The guy on the right was sequestering 3 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum measured over a 7-year period compared to the guy on the left, and you can even see it in the soil colour. This one here is irrigated, growing corn for 6 months of the year and growing forage crops for the other 6 months of the year, and it's gone from 0.7% organic carbon to 3.7% in 2.5 years. Now that's around 9 tonnes, an estimated 9 tonnes of carbon sequestered per hectare per annum, and that's carbon, not CO2, because you get to sell CO2, which is the exciting bit. And most of you will have heard of Gabe Brown. I was talking to Gabe just before Christmas, and Gabe just had his soils measured. He's got 460 tonnes of soil organic carbon down to 1.5 metres, and it was 7% organic carbon all the way. Now that is carbon sequestration, and he was actually doing that at a rate of 24 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum over the last few years. The thing that drives that is soil biology, and I'll leave it there. Thank you, Rebecca.